Chapter 11, Operating Procedures. T2A01. What's the most common repeater frequency offset in the 2-meter band? The offset of a repeater is the difference between the listen frequency and the transmit frequency. And in the 2-meter band, repeaters above 147 megahertz usually use a plus offset. They're listening on a frequency higher than that of the frequency on which they transmit. Repeaters below 147 megahertz use a minus offset. Modern radios almost always handle offset automatically. If you set your radio to a frequency lower than 147 and switch on duplex mode, the offset will be set up. You'll push the push-to-talk button, your radio will switch frequencies and transmit, and then it'll automatically switch back to the correct frequency to listen when you release the button. So, the most common repeater frequency offset in the 2-meter band is plus or minus 600 kilohertz. 2-meter band, 600 kilohertz. What is a common repeater frequency offset in the 70 centimeter band? This is T2A03. Plus or minus 5 megahertz, 5 million hertz, 5 megahertz. On the 70 centimeter band, that's the UHF band, or 440 band, the dividing point between plus and minus offset is 445 megahertz. Just remember, plus or minus 5 megahertz on the 440 band, the 70 centimeter band, plus or minus 600 kilohertz on the 2-meter band. Now, all of these repeater standards, VHF and UHF, are not really standard. They're just what's done most of the time. But there are plenty of repeaters out there that don't follow these guidelines. As they say in TV, check your local listings. T2A08. What's the meaning of the procedural signal CQ? CQ. There are at least two theories why we use CQ for calling any station. CQ dates back to the days when radio telegraphy was widely used, especially for international communications. One theory is that it's just shorthand for seek you, S-E-E-K-U, CQ. Another is that it sounds something like the beginning of the French word sécurité, which was used for pay attention by the international postal services. Now, it's entirely possible that one of those theories is true. Personally, I think seek you is the easier one to remember. So CQ means calling any station. T2A04. What's an appropriate way to call another station on a repeater if you know the other station's call sign? Well, you say the station's call sign and then identify with your call sign. The key phrase here is on a repeater. You'll find the world above 30 megahertz is a lot less formal than the HF bands, stuff below 30 megahertz, mostly because repeaters and FM make transmission much more dependable and easy to hear. If you want to call your friend on the local repeater, you just say their call sign and then your call sign. You don't do any break, CQ, breaker 19, none of that. If you were calling me, you'd just say AF7KB, KG1XXX, or AF7KB, this is KG1XXX. On the HF bands, on the high-frequency bands, on the other hand, you want to give the people who might receive your signal time to find it, and then to fine-tune it, and maybe even adjust the direction of their directional beam antenna. So in those bands, we use something like CQ, 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 KX1, XXX, Kilo, X-ray 1, X-ray, 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 CQ, CQ, CQ. We give them a little time to tune it in, without going overboard, one hopes. T2A09. What brief statement is often transmitted in place of CQ to indicate that you're listening on a repeater? Well, on a repeater, you just say your call sign. When you're listening to a repeater, you'll often hear someone just announce their call sign and nothing else. Well, now you'll know why they're doing that. They're saying, "Hi, I'm here. Anybody else out there?" T2A12. Which of the following is a guideline to use when choosing an operating frequency for calling CQ? Well, what you do is you listen first to be sure that no one else is using the frequency. You ask if the frequency is in use, and you make sure that you are in your assigned band. So, the way the question is written, all of the choices are correct. Now, your technician privileges won't include much below 30 megahertz, so you probably won't be doing a lot of calling CQ until you upgrade to general, unless you decide to learn Morse code. Still, these guidelines are good advice to follow before transmitting on any frequency. T2A05. How should you respond to a station calling CQ? Well, you transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. When it comes to responding to someone, this would be the same answer if you were on a repeater. So let's say my wife, she's KG7NVJ, wants to call me, AF7KB. Here's how it goes. The wife says AF7KB, KG7NVJ. And then I say KG7NVJ, AF7KB. What's up? That's as simple as that. T2A10. What is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? Well, a band plan is a voluntary guideline for using different modes or activities within an amateur band. So the band plan doesn't come from the FCC. It's our plan, our amateur plan for how to best divide up the frequencies that we've been granted. You'll find details of the current band plan at the ARRL website. While you visit there, you can download the Considerate Operators Frequency Guide. T2A11. Which of the following is an FCC rule regarding power levels used in the amateur bands under normal non-distress circumstances? We got a few choices here. One of them is there's no limit to power as long as there's no interference with other services. That's not the right answer. How about no more than 200 watts PEP may be used? That's not the rule they're looking for either. How about up to 1500 watts PEP may be used on any amateur frequency without restriction? Nope, that's not true. Here's the rule they're looking for. While not exceeding the maximum power permitted on a given band, use the minimum power necessary to carry out the desired communication. Different bands and different locations, primarily along the northern border of the U.S., have different power level limits. You don't have to memorize them all to get your technician class license, but it is important to know that there are limits, so you'll remember to look them up when the time comes. Overriding all the limits, though, is the basic rule that you don't use more power than you need to carry out the desired communication. That's just part of making the system work for everyone. T2B01. What's the term used to describe an amateur station that is transmitting and receiving on the same frequency? Well, that's called simplex communication. If you have your handheld 2-meter radio with you, and I have mine, we can both set our radios to transmit and receive on, pick a frequency, 147.150. How's that? That's simplex communication, with both using the same frequency to listen and to transmit. A repeater listens on one frequency, transmits what it's receiving on another frequency at the same time. That's duplex communication. Simplex, one frequency, duplex, meaning two frequencies. The repeater couldn't transmit on the same frequency that it's receiving, because then it would be receiving its own transmission, and that creates all sorts of problems. T2A02. What is the national calling frequency for FM simplex operations on the 70 centimeter band? 70 centimeter is the 440 band. Well, it's 446 megahertz, 446.00 megahertz. So there you are. You're driving across North Dakota and you're wondering if there are any hams to talk to. How would you find them? Well, you could look around for local repeater frequencies, or you could set your UHF mobile radio to 446.000 megahertz with simplex operation and announce your call sign. By our informal agreement, there's no law that says this. This is just what everybody does. By informal agreement, that's the calling frequency in the 70 centimeter band. It's the frequency we use for, hey, anybody out there, when we're not using a repeater. As you might guess, there are calling frequencies for each band, and you can always look those up at the ARRL. You don't have to memorize all of them. T2B12. Under what circumstances should you consider communicating via simplex rather than a repeater? Well, you do that when the stations can communicate directly without using a repeater. Simplex is simple. It uses one frequency. It's simpler than duplex, which uses two. If you can achieve your communication by using one frequency instead of two, do it. T2B02. What's the term used to describe the use of a sub-audible tone transmitted with normal voice audio to open the squelch of a receiver? That's called CTCSS, Continuous Tone Coded Squelch System. It's a clever way we managed to put a lot of repeaters into very little spectrum space, and it's used by really the majority of VHF and UHF repeaters. Here's how it works. A repeater using the CTCSS system is set up so that it only retransmits signals that include a specific tone. The tones are audible, but they're very low down there on the musical scale, under 300 hertz. To use that repeater, your transmitter, or your transceiver, has to be set up to send that particular tone, along with your voice, of course, while you have the push-to-talk switch pressed. The repeater hears the tone, it switches on the transmitter, it retransmits whatever you have to say. No tone, or the wrong tone, transmitter stays off. Just about any modern VHF-UHF radio will have the CTCSS function built in, but you'll need to learn how to program it properly to make it work with your favorite repeaters. T2B03. Which of the following describes the muting of receiver audio controlled solely by the presence or absence of an RF signal? Well, that's not like CTCSS. That's what we call carrier squelch. Be careful, this is asking about an RF radio frequency signal, not the AF audio frequency of CTCSS. A repeater using carrier squelch simply switches on the transmitter when it hears any signal on the received frequency. T4B03. What's the purpose of the squelch control on a transceiver? Well, that's to mute the receiver output noise when no signal is being received. Without a squelch control, you'd hear white noise coming blazing out of your receiver whenever it wasn't picking up someone's signal. The squelch automatically mutes the receiver unless it hears a certain level of RF. Once it senses that minimum level of signal, it switches on and then you can hear the signal. If your receiver has a squelch adjustment, you adjust it by turning up the volume on some unused frequency, and then you turn the squelch knob until you find the precise spot where it just switches off the sound, and that's where you want it set. T2B04. Which of the following common problems might cause you to be able to hear but not access a repeater even when you're transmitting with the proper offset? Well, these are the choices they give us. The repeater receiver may require an audio tone burst for access, or the repeater receiver may require a CTCSS tone for access, or the repeater receiver may require a DCS tone sequence for access. Well, the answer is all of these choices are correct. answer A that I gave you mentions an audio tone burst. While this could be used by U.S. amateurs, in practice it seldom is. It's more common in commercial two-way radio systems. The DCS mentioned in answer C that I gave you stands for digital coded squelch. It's less common than CTCSS, but it is used on some repeaters. If you aren't using the proper squelch system, you might be able to hear the repeater, but not be able to access it. T2B05. What determines the amount of deviation of an FM as opposed to a PM signal? Well, it's the amplitude of the modulating signal. Oh, wow, that's a lot of vocabulary all at once, isn't it? A radio signal starts off as an unmodulated carrier. It's just a sine wave at radio frequency. An unmodulated carrier doesn't carry any useful information. To add information to a carrier, we vary the carrier in some way, and that's called modulation. Over the years, we've come up with several different modulation methods. The original is CW for continuous wave, and that was the simplest. Just turn the carrier off and on to send the dots and dashes of the Morse code. It doesn't get any simpler than that. And CW is still one of the best modes when it comes to just sheer punch through the noise and make communication happen. The next modulation system invented by a brilliant Canadian named Reginald A. Fessenden, no kidding, was amplitude modulation, also known as AM. Now, put simply, amplitude modulation varies the strength of the carrier proportionate to the modulating signal, such as your voice. So you start with an unmodulated carrier, it's just going up and down at the same rate, but then you turn, sort of like turning the power up and down just in the shape that your voice would make. And when you take a look at the book, you can see some pictures of this in action. If we vary the amplitude of the carrier wave proportionate to the audio signal, we end up with an amplitude modulated radio signal. A frequency modulation, FM, varies the frequency of the carrier proportionate to the amplitude of the modulating signal, while the amplitude of the carrier wave stays the same. So think of the carrier staying the same amplitude, but it's swinging back and forth across a spot on the radio dial rather than getting louder and softer at the same spot on the dial. The amount that carrier swings back and forth, that's the deviation of an FM signal. So instead of the amplitude modulated signal, we get a frequency modulated signal. And you'll notice the carrier amplitude stays the same with FM. The amount the frequency varies is called the deviation of the signal. T2B06. What happens when the deviation of an FM transmitter is increased? Well, what happens is its signal occupies more bandwidth. The deviation of an FM transmitter is another way of saying how much do we vary the frequency of the carrier. It makes sense that more deviation means you're swinging that carrier back and forth across a wider spot on the dial, so that's more bandwidth. Let's cover this business of bandwidth just a bit. Even though we talk about radio signals being at, say 146.820 megahertz, any modulated radio signal spreads out across the dial. That FM repeater at 146.820 actually spreads from about 146.8125 to 146.8275. It takes that much bandwidth to carry the 15 kilohertz worth of information that the repeater can carry. Every modulated signal occupies some amount of bandwidth, even a Morse code signal. Bandwidth relates directly to how much information we can send and how fast we can send it. You could say the bandwidth limits the information, or you could say the information creates the bandwidth. Information theory tells us that the amount of information we can transmit can never exceed the bandwidth of the signal. So more bandwidth gives us the capability to transmit more information. That's why fast scan amateur television needs a rather huge 6 megahertz of bandwidth to transmit the 30 images per second that make up a television picture. And that's why FM phone tends to have greater intelligibility than, say, AM, what we call single sideband phone. However, less bandwidth lets us concentrate more of the transmitter's power into less space, letting our signal punch through more effectively. So as with just about everything, there's always a trade-off. T2B07, what could cause your FM signal to interfere with stations on nearby frequencies? Well, having your microphone gain too high, causing over-deviation. So you won't make your FM radio signal go farther by turning up the gain on your microphone. That carrier's going to stay the same strength no matter what. It won't help to shout into it either. You just make your signal distorted and possibly interfere with other stations, because what will happen is the carrier will swing back and forth across a wider spot on the dial, occupying more bandwidth and maybe interfering with a nearby station. While we're on the topic, shouting doesn't make your cell phone go farther either. Yes, now you know. T1B11. What emission modes are permitted in the mode-restricted subbands at 50.0 to 50.1 megahertz and 144.0 to 144.1 megahertz? What? Let's make some sense out of those new terms first, and then we'll get to the right answer for this question. First off, an emission mode. An emission mode is a fancy way of saying, how are we modulating the signal? Is it AM, is it FM, etc., etc. SSB stands for single sideband, about which you'll learn more later, and about which you will learn a good deal more if you decide to upgrade to your general class license. For now, just know that SSB is a way of sending voice or other sounds using amplitude modulation. RTTY, this is mentioned in one of the answers as well. That stands for radio teletype. Originally, it was a way to send messages from a teletype keyboard to a teletype printer, like you might have seen the AP or UPI teletype machines in a newspaper's newsroom. These days, of course, those machines are long obsolete and we use computers. RTTY happens to be one of those other sounds mentioned in the paragraph about single sideband, and it's sent as a series of tones that have a distinctive warbling sound, often using SSB transmission. CW, of course, stands for continuous wave. It's the dots and dashes, Morse code. Now, why don't we just call it MC? Well, CW means a particular way of sending Morse code, which happens to be the very simplest way, which is basically just switching the transmitter off and on to send the dots and dashes. Of all the ways we can send signals to each other, good old CW, the original radio system, is still the most consistently reliable and the one that uses the least bandwidth. Bandwidth, remember, refers to how much of the electromagnetic spectrum is taken up by a particular signal. Sometimes you'll hear people say a particular signal is really wide on the dial. That means it's occupying a lot of bandwidth. The bandwidth of a signal determines how much information we can send, how fast we can send it. Even though all the requirements to learn Morse code have been eliminated from the amateur license tests, the code is still used extensively in amateur radio. And it's mostly because CW uses the spectrum so efficiently that certain areas of the ham frequencies are limited to CW only. So from that, you can probably guess that the correct answer to this question, which was what emission modes are permitted in the mode-restricted subbands at 50.0 to 50.1 megahertz, at 144.0 to 144.1 megahertz, the correct answer is CW only. Whew, that's a long way to go for one question, wasn't it? T8A07. What is the primary advantage of single sideband over FM for voice transmissions? We get a few choices. SSB signals are easier to tune. No, they're not. SSB signals are less susceptible to interference. No, they're not. How about all of these choices are correct? We know that's not right. So the right answer is SSB, single sideband signals, have narrower bandwidth. T8A11. What is the approximate maximum bandwidth required to transmit a CW signal? A CW signal about 150 hertz. 150 hertz. It's really skinny. What is the approximate bandwidth of a single sideband voice signal? It's about 3 kilohertz. About 3 kilohertz, 3,000 hertz. Single sideband, about 3K. Which of the following is true of the use of SSB phone in amateur bands above 50 megahertz? It's permitted in at least some portion of all the amateur bands above 50 megahertz. Yeah, you can use single sideband phone on at least some portion of all the amateur bands above 50 megahertz. It's permitted. It is not real common. T8A09. What is the approximate bandwidth of a VHF repeater FM phone signal? A VHF repeater FM phone signal. FM is going to be between 10 and 15 kilohertz. 10 to 15 kilohertz. What's the typical bandwidth of analog fast scan TV transmissions on the 70 centimeter band? About 6 megahertz, million hertz, 6 megahertz wide. Has to send a new picture 30 times a second, and that requires a lot of bandwidth. T2B08. Which of the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other? Well, what the FCC says is common courtesy should prevail, but no one has absolute right to an amateur frequency. They're basically saying, play nice, work it out amicably among yourselves. And amazingly enough, for nearly 100 years, hams have been doing exactly that. T2B09. Which of the following methods is encouraged by the FCC when identifying your station when using phone, when you're using voice? Well, they encourage the use of a phonetic alphabet. Now, there is a semi-official phonetic alphabet. It's known as the NATO phonetic alphabet, and this is it. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, Juliet, Kilo, Lima, Mike, November, Oscar, Papa, that's the way they want us to say it, Quebec, some of us might say Quebec, but the official pronunciation is Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, Tango, Uniform, Victor, Whiskey, X-Ray, Yankee, Zulu, and then the numbers are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Okay? All the numbers are normal except 9, and they make that 9er. Now, there's no legal requirement for us as amateurs to use this particular alphabet, but it is a well-constructed and a tested one, and one that's broadly understood in the ham community. Now, on the other hand, one of the best ham radio teachers ever is Gordon West. His call is WB6NOA, and as long as I've been hearing his tapes, he's been calling himself WB6 Nancy Ocean America, even though the official alphabet would have him be Whiskey Bravo 6 November Oscar Alpha. So, whatever works for you and the person receiving you is just fine. T2C03. What should be done to ensure that voice message traffic containing proper names and unusual words are copied correctly by the receiving station? Well, here it is again. Such words and terms should be spelled out using a standard phonetic alphabet. T2B10. Which Q signal indicates that you're receiving interference from other stations? Q signal? Hams use all sorts of what are known as Q signals, especially when sending Morse code. Q signals were first developed by the early telegraphers, and they're a form of shorthand. They save a lot of dots and dashes. They're also understood by most hams all over the world, so you can get around a lot of language difficulties with Q signals. You'll only need to know 2 Q signals for your technician exam, and one of them is QRM. QRM means I'm receiving interference from other stations. QRM, and I guess you could remember it as standing for quite a radio mess. QRM, interference. T2B11. Which Q signal indicates that you are changing frequency? Well, that one is QSY. QSY. And if you pronounce it like Quissy, it sounds something like the Quincy in frequency, and maybe that's a good way to remember that QSY means changing frequency. T2C04. What do RACES and ARES have in common? RACES is R-A-C-E-S. ARES is A-R-E-S. Well, both organizations may provide communications during emergencies. Now, RACES and ARES are completely separate services, but both might provide communications during emergencies. ARES is Amateur Radio Emergency Service. ARES exists to offer emergency and auxiliary communication services for public safety organizations. It's a program of the ARRL, and it's organized and run by amateur radio operators. Now, most ARES chapters are autonomous local organizations. If you want to volunteer for ARES, you contact your local ARES emergency coordinator. Most of the ARES chapters require active members to participate in some training so that they're ready to go if the worst happens. RACES, something completely different. That's the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. RACES is a civil defense program. It was created by the FCC. It's administered by the Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, and it's under the immediate control of local civil defense authorities, which, who that is in your particular state can vary wildly. The idea of RACES was created in the early 1950s with the purpose of creating an on-demand emergency radio service utilizing amateur radio operators who'd been pre-cleared by the RACES authorities. The real underlying idea of RACES was that in wartime, and remember this was created early in the Cold War, the amateur service would be usurped for the purpose of civil defense. Since then, it's proved to be useful even though we've managed to avoid a nuclear war. To participate in RACES, you must be registered with the appropriate authorities in your area. So for purposes of the test, remember anytime you see RACES, the key phrase is civil defense. Now, if emergency service appeals to you, you'll no doubt be quite welcome in either or both of your local ARES and RACES groups. In most areas, there are regular on-air meetings, nets of the groups, and that may be the best way to track down the contact people. And, of course, there is no requirement to provide such emergency service. T2C05. Which of the following describes the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, RACES? Well, they give us a lot of answers here. One is a radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications. Well, that's true. A radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. Yeah, that's true. An emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. Well, that's true too. So, all of these choices are correct. Anytime a question asks about RACES, look for the key phrase civil defense, and in this question, that phrase appears in 3 answers. T2C12. What is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service? Licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communication duty in the public service. That's the correct answer. The other answers they give us are a little tempting. Licensed amateurs who are members of the military and who voluntarily agreed to provide message handling services in the case of an emergency. Gee, sounds like it could be, but it isn't. A training program that provides licensing courses for those interested in obtaining an amateur license to use during emergencies. Sounds good? Isn't the answer. A training program that certifies amateur operators for membership in the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. Oh, that's RACES, and they were asking about ARES, so that's not the answer. The ARES is licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duties in the public service. T2C06, which of the following is an accepted practice to get the immediate attention of a net control station when you're reporting an emergency? An emergency. Well, you begin your transmission by saying priority or emergency, followed by your call sign. Generally, priority means this is pretty important and it won't be useful a few minutes from now. Emergency means life, limb, and or property are in immediate danger. Get off this frequency now. I need to transmit. So priority or emergency and then your call sign. T2C07. Which of the following is an accepted practice for an amateur operator who is checked into an emergency traffic net? They give us some pretty funny choices here. One is, provided that the frequency is quiet, announce the station call sign and location every 5 minutes. Don't do that. Move 5 kilohertz away from the net's frequency and use high power to ask other hams to keep clear of the net frequency. No, you don't want to do that. You'd be interfering with the net, and besides, you'd be being an idiot. Or remain on frequency without transmitting until you're asked to do so by the net control station. Yes, that's the answer. Just stay there, don't transmit until they ask you to do so. And remember, this is for an emergency traffic net. Nets are on-air meetings, and there are all sorts of nets for all sorts of purposes. One of our local nets here in the Seattle area is just a purely social, hey, let's all check in with each other at this time every evening. And another is a very formal RACES update net. And yet another is a nightly traffic net for the purpose of passing along messages being sent around the world by people. So an emergency traffic net would be a net set up to handle messages for people affected by an emergency. Being disciplined and efficient would be really important. A net will typically begin with the ham serving as net control, asking for check-ins from the people who want to participate. Okay, so net control says, I'm taking check-ins now, and once I've said, this is AF7KB, Michael in Seattle, I'm checked in. And then I'll wait until net control says something like, okay, next up AF7KB Michael in Seattle. And then I'll say whatever it is I have to say on that particular net. What the question is really describing is good procedure for any net, not just an emergency traffic net. T2C08. Which of the following is a characteristic of good emergency traffic handling? Well, passing messages exactly as received. It's an emergency. Your job as a ham volunteer is to pass messages exactly as received. Are amateur station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license class? Well, yes, they are, but only if it's necessary in situations involving the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. We've come across this before. If it's an emergency, the rule book says throw out the rule book and do what needs to be done to save someone's life or property. There is no other time that we can do that. T2C10. What is the preamble in a formal traffic message? Well, that's the information needed to track the message as it passes through the amateur radio traffic handling system. The preamble contains such information as the priority of the message, the originating station, the destination, how the message is to be delivered, whether it's mail or telephone, etc., and other information to assure the proper handling of the message. That's the preamble. T2C11. What's meant by the term check in reference to a formal traffic message? Well, the check is a count of the number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. Hi, Mom. Having a great time in Omaha. Wish you were here. That'd have a check of 12 because it consists of 12 words. Chapter 12, Radio Waves and Propagation. Propagation is the study of how radio waves spread and how they interact with the world. And it's a pretty complex topic. You could probably spend the rest of your life studying radio wave propagation and never get to the complete end of it, but we're just going to go over some of the basics for your technician class license. Question T3A01. What should you do if another operator reports that your station's 2-meter signals were strong just a moment ago, but now they're weak or distorted? Well, what you should do is try moving a few feet or changing the direction of your antenna if possible, as reflections may be causing multipath distortion. Higher frequency signals tend to bounce off solid objects, while lower frequencies tend to basically go around those objects. Any reflection is, of course, going to take a slightly longer path to your radio than the direct line from your radio to the transmitter. And this means the waves of the reflected signal are offset from the main signal, and they can cancel out all or part of the main signal. When this happens, we call it multipath. Sometimes moving just a few feet is enough to correct the problem. You've probably experienced this if you've ever moved an FM radio a foot or two and found no signal in one spot and good signal in another. Now you know what was happening. There wasn't really no signal in that spot, probably. What it was several signals combining to interfere with each other and cancel each other out, so that effectively you had no signal. The correct answer mentions changing the direction of your antenna. All antennas are to some extent directional. They pick up and transmit signals better in some directions than in others. If you're having problems receiving or transmitting, it's worth a try to move your antenna in some direction, just any direction. And sometimes with a bit of trial and error, you can make big improvements with small changes. Some of us are old enough to remember learning this lesson with those old rabbit ear antennas. Remember those on our parents' televisions? Well, some of us remember. T3A06. What term is commonly used to describe the rapid fluttering sound that's sometimes heard from mobile stations that are moving while transmitting? Well, they give us a few choices here: flip-flopping, picket fencing, frequency shifting, and pulsing. I guess they all maybe could work, but what we call that is picket fencing. Picket fencing. When we experience multipath distortion while we're in motion, it's called picket fencing. When you're driving and your car FM radio is going la 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 la, like that, get that little interference, that's picket fencing. T3A08. Which of the following is a likely cause of irregular fading of signals received by ionospheric reflection? Ionospheric reflection. Signals going clear up to the ionosphere, bouncing off and coming back down to Earth. Well, that's random combining of signals arriving via different paths. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's what we were just talking about, multipath. It's just another way to say multipath. As a technician, using mostly frequencies above 30 megahertz, most of your multipath will be the result of objects on Earth, like buildings, rocks, bridge abutments, passing semi-trucks, etc. As we move down in frequency on the HF bands, the effects of the ionosphere become more important, and the effects of things on Earth become less important. So this question is just about multipath happens to be bouncing off the ionosphere. T3A10. What may occur if data signals propagate over multiple paths? Data signals. Well, what may happen is error rates are likely to increase. Just as you might miss a couple of important words that DJ is saying on your car radio when you experience some multipath interference there, your data receiver might miss a few bytes of a digital transmission if it happened to experience some multipath. More technically, and not for this test, coming up later, some digital modes are very sensitive to the phase distortion that can occur with multipath. T3A05. When you're using a directional antenna, how might your station be able to access a distant repeater if buildings or obstructions are blocking the direct line of sight path? Well, what you could do is try to find a path that reflects signals to the repeater. Just bounce the signal off of something. The fact that our signals bounce around isn't necessarily a bad thing. By taking advantage of the fact that those waves bounce, and particularly our VHF and UHF waves, sometimes we can make what you might call a ricochet shot to the radio that we're trying to reach by pointing our directional antenna towards something that might bounce it in. Hey, it's worth a try. T3A02. Why are UHF signals often more effective from inside buildings than VHF signals? Why would that be? Well, it's because the shorter wavelength allows them to more easily penetrate the structure of buildings. So propagation isn't just about radio waves. It's about the interaction of radio waves with the rest of the universe. And it's more complicated than just short waves bounce. In the text just above this, I mentioned higher frequency waves tend to bounce off solid objects. And that's generally true. From that, you might reason that lower frequency VHF would be less likely to bounce off the inside of a building than higher frequency UHF. And confusingly enough, that's true too. However, this question isn't asking about reflection, but about absorption versus penetration. Now, those are related, but different from reflection. If you're inside a perfectly solid steel building, neither VHF nor UHF are going to have much of a chance of getting out. But buildings don't usually look perfectly solid to radio waves, and the smaller UHF waves have a better chance of finding a weak spot and penetrating the walls. At least you can think of it that way. Think of those tiny little UHF waves slipping through a crack, out a window, or through the space between a couple of those concrete reinforcing bars. Now, the real practical truth is that neither VHF nor UHF are likely to work superbly when your antenna is indoors, but UHF is your better bet if you happen to be inside a building. The study of the propagation of radio waves is endlessly complicated, it's endlessly fascinating, and it's still advancing. T3A03. What antenna polarization is normally used for long-distance, weak signal CW and SSB contacts using the VHF and UHF bands? The polarization of an antenna refers to its orientation relative to the ground. For an antenna to receive a signal, it's best if it's oriented the same as the transmitting antenna. So if a wire is stretched across parallel to the ground, that would be a horizontally polarized antenna. If it's a vertical piece of wire, like maybe a mobile antenna on a car, that's a vertically polarized antenna. There are some technical reasons why horizontal polarization tends to work better for long-distance, weak-signal CW and SSB contacts on the VHF and UHF bands. So the answer to this question is horizontal. By long distance, we generally mean farther away than your usual local repeaters. To remember this question's answer, you might imagine a long horizontal line for long distance. There's also such a thing as circular polarization, although it's not left-hand circular polarization like one of the wrong answers for this question. To picture circular polarization, imagine this. Imagine you had a whip antenna like a typical car antenna with a really fast motor mounted in the center so that the antenna could spin. If it could spin fast enough, say almost the speed of light, it would be as though it was both vertical and horizontal and everything in between. Well, obviously that system is completely impractical, but we can accomplish essentially the same thing electrically through clever antenna design. Because orbiting satellites, or orbiting ham satellites, because those satellites spin, we use circularly polarized antennas for amateur satellite communications. But for long-distance, weak signal CW and SSB on the VHF and UHF bands, horizontal polarization is what works best. T3A09. Which of the following results from the fact that skip signals refracted from the ionosphere are elliptically polarized? Elliptically polarized? Well, if a signal is elliptically polarized, it's both vertical and horizontal, but more one than another. Think of it as a sort of lopsided variation of circular polarization. So the answer to this question, if the signal is coming back down, it's been scrambled around in the ionosphere, and it's been elliptically polarized, what that means is either vertically or horizontally polarized antennas may be used for transmission or reception. T3A04. What can happen if the antennas at opposite ends of a VHF or UHF line-of-sight radio link are not using the same polarization? Well, you can probably guess the signals could be significantly weaker. T3A07. What type of wave carries radio signals between transmitting and receiving stations? Well, an antenna radiates both electric and magnetic fields. Put them together, and you have the correct answer to this question, which is electromagnetic waves. Electromagnetic waves, those are radio waves. What are the two components of a radio wave? Well, I just gave that one away, didn't I? Electric and magnetic fields. What property of a radio wave is used to describe its polarization? That's the orientation of the electric field. Remember, a transmitting antenna is radiating both an electric field and a magnetic field. The magnetic field happens to be rotated 90 degrees from the electric field, and it's not very strong relative to the electric field. It's the electric field that really does the work of carrying your signal. So that's the polarization to which we pay attention. Now, this business of polarization, I suggest you not try to imagine it in 3D and in motion. I did. My head almost exploded. Maybe you're smarter than I am, but that was my result. It's one of those things that it's probably best to just take on faith and really just keep a simple model in your mind, because you don't need a more complicated model than just there's a wave coming off of that horizontal wire and the wave happens to be horizontal. Just imagine it that way. T3B08. What are the frequency limits of the VHF spectrum, the very high frequency spectrum? Well, that's 30 to 300 megahertz. The ham bands below 30 to 300 megahertz are HF for high frequency. 30 to 300 megahertz, That's very high frequency, VHF. 300 to 3000 megahertz is UHF, ultra high frequency. So those are some of the choices you have for answers on that question. Remember, it's 30 to 300 megahertz. One of the answers they give you 300 to 3000 kilohertz. Got to read it carefully. Kilohertz, that frequency band is not part of the ham bands. T3B09, what are the frequency limits of the UHF spectrum? We just covered this. It's 300 to 3000 megahertz. Always double check those units. In this one, they give you 30 to 300 kilohertz, 30 to 300 megahertz, 300 to 3000 kilohertz, and 300 to 3000 megahertz. So always double check that you're picking the right units. The answer to this one is 300 to 3000 megahertz. What frequency range is referred to as HF? That's 3 to 30 megahertz. 3 to 30 megahertz. The ham frequencies below VHF are generally called HF for high frequency. Now, if you get real technical and precise about it, the 160 meter band actually gets down below HF to MF, medium frequency, but common usage among hams includes 160 in the HF range. And if you see a modern radio advertised as an HF radio, it probably also covers 160. T3A11. Which part of the atmosphere enables the propagation of radio signals around the world? Well, it's not the stratosphere. That's up there, but doesn't have anything to do with radio, really. The troposphere, that's the air down here, that's not it. The magnetosphere, not really. The one we're looking for is the ionosphere. The ionosphere. Far above the surface, above the troposphere and the stratosphere, about 50 to 300 miles up, a very few molecules of air interact with charged particles from the sun and create the ionosphere. And the ionosphere is constantly changing. Those charged particles can act as mirrors for radio waves, sometimes. As the Earth rotates out of day into night, we gain access to different layers of the ionosphere, and this changes which frequencies will bounce back to Earth and which will just continue out into space. As a technician, you probably won't deal much with ionospheric effects because VHF and UHF signals usually just zap right through it. If you decide to move up to general and get more involved with the HF bands, you'll learn much more about how to take advantage of the propagation effects of the ionosphere. T3C01. Why are direct, not via a repeater, UHF signals rarely heard from stations outside your local coverage area? Well, that's because UHF signals are usually not reflected by the ionosphere. Those UHF signals have a short wavelength. Remember how they can sneak right through maybe some drywall and get out of a building? Well, they can certainly sneak right through those few molecules of air up there that make up the ionosphere. T3C02. Which of the following might be happening when VHF signals are being received from long distances? Let's see the choices they give us. A. Signals are being reflected from outer space. Signals are arriving by subsurface ducting. What? Signals are being reflected by lightning storms in your area. Signals are being refracted from a sporadic E layer. Do they have choice E? Because none of those sounds very likely, does it? Well, it happens to be that last one, sporadic E layer. The sporadic E layer refers to the E layer of the ionosphere. The ionosphere consists of several layers. The closest to the Earth is about 30 miles up, and it's called the D layer. The D layer is only present during the day. The E layer is next, followed by the F layers. Those are F1 and F2. Most of the time, we're able to bounce HF signals, but not VHF, off of the F layers at night, achieving long-distance communication, and that's called skywave propagation. Sometimes, a solar storm will come along, and it'll create dense spots in the E layer that happen to allow us to bounce VHF signals off of it and achieve long-distance skywave communication with VHF. And those moments are referred to as sporadic E. Sporadic because they don't happen very often. It's not very common to be able to bounce VHF signals off the ionosphere. As you'll learn in some questions below, tropospheric effects are more common. However, for this question, sporadic E is the only answer given that makes, frankly, any sense at all. Neither outer space nor lightning storms reflect radio signals, and I have no idea what subsurface ducting is, but it has nothing to do with radio waves. T3C04. Which of the following propagation types is most commonly associated with occasional, strong, over-the-horizon signals on the 10, 6, and 2 meter bands? 10, 6, and 2 meter bands. Well, that's sporadic E again. Sporadic E. The choices they give us are backscatter, sporadic E, D-layer absorption, and gray line propagation. And of those, the only one that's going to give you occasional, strong, over-the-horizon signals on 10, 6, and 2 meters is sporadic E. What is a characteristic of VHF signals received via auroral reflection? This is T3C03. Well, the signals exhibit rapid fluctuations of strength and often sound very distorted. They sound really weird is what they sound. You ever hear those ghost voices in a horror movie, like, you can't quite understand it, and it sounds all raspy and whispery. That's what a lot of aurora-propagated signals sound like. They fade in, they fade out, they turn into whispers, they quaver. You'll never forget it once you hear it. You can search around the web and look on YouTube or a few other sites, and you can hear recordings that people have made of the signals they've picked up from the aurora. T3C05. Which of the following effects might cause radio signals to be heard despite obstructions between the transmitting and receiving stations? Well, that's knife-edge diffraction. Sometimes radio waves behave in surprising ways, and knife-edge diffraction might be one of those. It occurs when a radio wave passes by a clearly defined edge, such as the corner of a building or maybe the top of a mountain range, and then that edge bends the path of the radio wave. Sometimes this sends our signal off in some utterly useless direction. Sometimes it almost miraculously lets our radio sort of see around a corner. Knife-edge diffraction. T3C06. What mode is responsible for allowing over-the-horizon VHF and UHF communications to ranges of approximately 300 miles on a regular basis? There's your key, the regular basis. So if it's regular, it isn't sporadic, so it isn't sporadic E. And thank goodness they didn't list that as one of the possible answers anyway. What that is tropospheric scatter. Tropospheric scatter. The troposphere, or the troposphere, is the lowest layer of the atmosphere. It's the one we're walking around in. Because it has density, it affects our radio signals. Some signals are almost completely unaffected. Some are affected more intensely. In the case of VHF and UHF frequencies, the troposphere bounces the signals around just enough to kind of bend them just over the horizon. And what this means is the range of your VHF, UHF radio is just a bit farther than line of sight. You can get just over that distant horizon there. T3C07. What band is best suited for communicating via meteor scatter? Meteor scatter? Hams just love to try to bounce signals off things to achieve what seems impossible. And in the case of communicating via meteor scatter, they're attempting to bounce signals off the cylinders of ionized air molecules that are left, briefly, behind by meteors as they come rocketing in toward Earth. Now, as a practical, reliable communication system, this is about as good an idea as sending smoke signals in a hurricane, but who said something had to be practical to be fun, right? The band that's best suited for communicating via meteor scatter is 6 meters. 6 meters. Amateurs who specialize in working meteor scatter say their best results are usually in the 6 meter band. T3C08. What causes tropospheric ducting? Tropospheric ducting. Well, that's temperature inversions in the atmosphere. Tropospheric ducting is slightly different from tropospheric scatter. They're related. Tropospheric ducting occurs when a temperature inversion is present. So in normal conditions, as we get farther from the surface of the Earth, the air temperature gets cooler. A temperature inversion occurs when there's a layer of warm air that's sandwiched between cool air at the surface and cool air up above. It's like, it's a sandwich. Cool, warm, and then more cool on the top. What that does, because of the different densities that are involved there, is creates almost a pipe, a duct that'll bounce VHF and occasionally UHF signals between the top of the layer and the bottom, and then the top and then the bottom, and that can go on for miles and miles and miles. And amazingly, what comes out the other end is usually a quite good signal. I remember sitting in Barstow, California one time. It's way down at the southern end of California. And I was sitting in my truck and wanted to listen to an NPR station. And I was tuning around, and I have a little app on my phone that'll let me find the closest NPR station, right? Well, couldn't pick it up. But I tuned around a bit and I found one, and I was listening to it and thought nothing of it until they identified themselves as being in Cheyenne, Wyoming. They were coming in like a local station. Well, what was going on? It was tropospheric ducting that was forming a duct between Cheyenne, Wyoming, and clear the far south end of California, and carrying that signal just like it was in a pipeline right down to my truck. It's pretty amazing when it happens. T3C09. What's generally the best time for long-distance 10-meter band propagation via the F layer? Long-distance 10-meter band propagation via the F layer. Well, that's from dawn to shortly after sunset during periods of high sunspot activity. 10-meter waves are short enough to punch through the D layer that's present in the daytime, but they're long enough to bounce off of the F layer if that layer has been strengthened by some sunspot activity. As a technician, you do have limited privileges in the 10-meter band. You're restricted to 200 watts, and you can send only data from 28.000 to 28.3 megahertz, and single sideband voice from 28.3 up to 28.5. There's no 10-meter FM for you until you get your general. So that's something to look forward to. T3C10. What is the radio horizon? The radio horizon. Well, that's the distance over which two stations can communicate by a direct path. The radio horizon is just a bit more distant than the visual horizon. T3C11. Why do VHF and UHF radio signals usually travel somewhat farther than the visual line of sight between two stations, the visual line of sight distance between two stations? Well, that's because the Earth seems less curved to radio waves than to light. Yeah. If you could see in radio frequencies. If your eyes would work in radio frequencies, you'd be able to see over the horizon. On the other hand, you wouldn't be able to see anything smaller than about half the wavelength of the radio wave. So if you could only see in 2-meter radio waves, any object smaller than about a meter would be invisible. And if you think about it, that explains a lot about propagation. T3C12. Which of the following bands may provide long-distance communications during the peak of the sunspot cycle? The peak of the sunspot cycle. Well, 6 or 10 meters may provide long-distance communications during the peak of the sunspot cycle. 6 or 10 meters. Those higher frequencies they list on the wrong answers, 23 centimeters, 70 centimeters, 1.25 meters. Those higher frequencies are too high to bounce off the F layer, even with the help of sunspots. There just aren't enough molecules up there to make it work.